My name's Ron Thulin. I started at WKY in 1975, and it's an incredible story on how I got into Channel 4. And before I get into the story, I got to say, if it wasn't for Channel 4 and for the people that surrounded me and what I learned at Channel 4, I wouldn't still be in the business today, some 30 whatever years later. But in 1975, I was still a student at back then, Bethany Nazarene College. One of my best friends was Steve Newman. We went to school together. He was teaching a television class at the college, and he and I were talking one night, and I said, listen, I really want to get into television. I want to do sports one of these days. And he said, I think the station may be hiring somebody to work in the summer, but you got to know how to shoot film. No tape back then, of course. And I said, well, okay. I said, I'll learn. He said, well, listen, come over to my house tomorrow night, and I'll teach you how to shoot film, and we'll try to get an audition tape for you. And I said, good. So I go to Steve's house, and we walk out of his house, and he's got the old Bell & Howell. The wind-up had the fixed lens on it. You could throw it off a 100-story building, and it wouldn't break, one of those kind of cameras. And we walk out of his house to get in this god-awful yellow Vet he used to have. And I noticed in the distance there was this big plume of smoke. And I said, Steve, what the heck is that? So he runs inside, he calls the assignment desk at Channel 4, and they said, well, the stockyards has caught fire. So Newman says, okay, let's get in the car, let's go. So Steve, on a good day he can't drive, and when he's in a hurry he really couldn't drive. And we're weaving in and out of traffic. We get down to the stockyards, and lo and behold, we're the first two people there as far as TV news crew. So Steve's got that old Bell & Howell, and he starts shooting, and the place is going up, and there's fire trucks all over the place. He goes, okay, get back in the car. So we go back in the car, and he runs back up to Channel 4, turns the film in to get developed, and he edits it and puts it all together, and it gets on the air. I didn't know, but Steve then took some of that film and the edited version and gave it to Jack Ogle and said, listen, I got this kid. He's pretty good. He shot part of that stuff last night of the fire at the stockyards, and he also edited. I didn't even touch the camera. I had no idea how to shoot. I didn't know what sequencing was. I didn't know how to edit tape. And Steve just told Jack Ogle, yeah, this guy's pretty good. So, they bring me in, and Jack says, well, it's going to be, gopher work, but, we saw some of the stuff you shot. And I went, yeah, good. And he goes, okay, you're going to be hired. So they hired me, and I go into Newman's office. I said, you got to teach me. This is not good. So lo and behold, I get this job as a gopher, running tapes to the Turnpike entrance, which I don't think we'd be able to do now, to make sure they got to KTUL in Tulsa. And then they let me shoot my own stuff. And back then I was, Ray Vaughn was the weekend anchor, and there were, Daryl Barton was teaching me how to shoot, which is a whole other story. But the one time they sent me out, Steve Newman and I went out on it was one of the first things I ever did as a photographer. They sent us out to interview this presidential candidate. And we get down to the hotel right by the Capitol, and there's like 3 of us in this room, and with about 30 seats, but there's only 3 of us. And we walk in and we interview this guy, and nobody's there. And this guy supposedly is running for president of the United States. We walk out, and Newman turns to me and he goes, man, it's too bad that guy never had a chance. He's a nice guy. Well, it turned out to be Jimmy Carter. So, our predictions were really good on that one. The best story of me as a photographer, there was a building going to be demolished in downtown Oklahoma City. So they sent me down to shoot it. I get down there, I'm all nervous. It's very early in the morning, it's nervous. It's my first one-man thing. I didn't have anybody with me, not a reporter. I made sure the batteries were charged, and everything was all set. And I put it on the tripod, and there's this guy from Channel 9 next to me. And I said, which building is it? He goes, well, it's that one over there. I said, oh, okay. So I get the shot all, man, I'm ready to go. And they do the countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I hear, boom, 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 boom. The building doesn't go down. I take the camera, I pan to the right, and the building's already down. I was shooting the wrong building. And if I'm not mistaken, it did get on the air because it was so funny that I totally messed it up. So while I was doing the part-time photographer and just kind of the gopher job, there was a sports job going to open up, and once again, Steve Newman says, oh, you need to apply. I had no experience. I had nothing, tape on the air, 0. All I was doing was the gopher stuff. And Steve goes, go ahead and apply. Well, Steve was doing like the 1 a.m. news back then, and he says, come on in and I'll teach you how to be on the air. So we did a little audition tape, and I turned it into Bob Berry, and You know, my hair was about down to here, and I probably weighed maybe 100 pounds, and I was a total geek. And lo and behold, Bob hires me. And that time in sports, and even before that, dealing with Daryl, and dealing with Daryl Barton and Ernie Schultz and Jack Ogle and Ron Turner, Brad Edwards, all these people that were allowed to come into my life were building a foundation for me in the business, which when things happen now, I still go back a lot of the times to what those people taught me. Brad Edwards taught me just to relax and it's going to be okay. Robbie Robertson and Bob Berry taught me that make sure whatever you put on the air is correct and don't make it your opinion, make it facts. Ernie Schultz, Jack Ogle taught me how to work hard. Bob Berry taught me how to have fun and enjoy the job. I mean, you're basically wearing makeup and talking to yourself. I mean, how tough's that? So I learned all this stuff, but when I got the sports job, I knew my dream had come true. But I didn't realize at that time how special it was working with Bob and Robbie and everybody else that we had to work with. It was a special time. It taught me so much about not only doing television sports, but also doing play-by-play. And to this day, even as my job now on Fox as a play-by-play announcer, I still do what Bob Berry taught me. There was an incident this past football season. I did Tulane and Tulsa football where the young man had the spinal cord injury. And the young man was lying on the field, Devin Walker, and the first thing I thought of was, oh my goodness, this kid's mom and dad are watching this. I gotta be careful what I say. And I told everybody through the talkback, don't put any information on unless you know it's 100% true. And it hit me, that was Robbie. And that was Bob telling me that back in 1976. And so that lesson I learned so many years ago from those guys still resonates in my career today, and it was so special. If it wasn't for Channel 4 and the people there and people giving me a chance, I don't know where I'd be today. When I had applied for the sports job, I was pretty excited that I might get it, even though I was going up against guys that had a lot more talent and resume than I had. And I'll never forget, Mr. Schultz takes me into one of the dressing rooms down one of the old hallways, and he pulls me in. He says, "You're applying for the sports job, right?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And he said, "Rob, stick to being a photographer. I don't think you have the talent to be on the air." And probably to this day, he still thinks the same thing, but that's okay. It's not a problem. Daryl Barton. I was so intimidated by him. If he'd walk in the door right now, I'd probably still start shaking because he critiqued us so hard, and he was the best. I go around the country now and I tell people I used to work in Oklahoma City. Most of the time the photographers will say to me, "Did you know Daryl Barton?" Yes, I worked at Daryl Barton. But Daryl was such a perfectionist, and he was such a visionary, and he was so far ahead of his time as a photographer. And I remember coming in one time from shooting some sporting event, and that's when we had the old Scoop-It camera, and we weren't allowed the CP16s yet. And then, of course, we went to videotape. But I came in, and Daryl just comes up, and of course his pants were always drooping down to below his waist. He was hip-hop before I think hip-hop even came around. And he'd stand there and he'd kind of look at you, and I said, "What?" And he goes, "Turn on your camera." I go, "Why?" He goes, "Shoot soft." Turns around and walks away. Kind of got the hint that it was my problem. Or he'd used to come up to us and say, "Hey, were you shooting that story on a boat?" So he always intimidated the daylights out of me. But once again, he made me appreciate pictures, because as a television sportscaster, you've got words, but the pictures tell the story better than you will ever. And working with Daryl allowed me to appreciate that so much more than I think if I didn't have the opportunity to be a shooter. There's so many lessons, I think all of us who started out in the business back then that we learned. One was none of us had teleprompters. And to this day, I don't use a teleprompter. I've used it maybe a handful of times in the last 25 years. But it taught us to learn the stories, not necessarily memorize the stories, but learn the stories. And as I talk with some of my former colleagues about what Channel 4 and WKY-TV taught us, back then our reporters, I don't care who they were, They were reporters in the true sense of the word. They weren't repeaters. I think that started at the top. I think Ernie Schultz and Jack Ogle and Ron Turner and everybody that we worked with, they stressed integrity. And it's sad because I don't see that anymore. Their stuff get on the air right now, and there are many times I turn to my wife or turn to friends and I'll say, boy, that would have never gotten on the air on Channel 4. The old line that if it bleeds, it leads, and people wanted to make this sensational. The one thing I think I'm most proud of working at WKY was the fact that we were real journalists. We worked hard. People tried to get the stories. They tried to get the stories right. We tried to get the pictures right. And I think the integrity that station had, you don't see very often anymore, if any. And I think that's really sad. And I just am so thankful that I had people in my life back then that taught me how important that was. There are so many personalities we had back then. I think back to Ernie Schultz, obviously, and when Ernie would get mad, it was legendary that he'd go in his office and you'd see him on the phone, and then you'd hear this crunch and he'd slam the phone down. He was a priceless guy. Jack Ogle, though, was probably my favorite. You know, he'd always come in, he'd look disheveled, his tie would be undone, and he was just so believable on the air. But after we basically lied my way into my first job, I remember when I finally got on TNT, was doing the NBA, and I came back in town, and somebody did a story on me in one of the newspapers, and I relayed the story how Steve Newman basically shot my audition tape and wrote it and all that. And I get this call, and I go, hello? And they go, Ron Thulin? I go, yeah, it's Jack Ogle. I said, oh, Mr. Ogle. I still couldn't call him Jack. I mean, to this day, I have problems calling him Jack. I said, oh, Mr. Ogle, how you doing? Haven't heard from you in a while. And he just paused. He goes, I saw the article. I said, what article? And he goes, about you. I said, you did? And he goes, yeah, you lying son of a gun. I knew you didn't shoot that stuff. So he actually knew that Steve Newman shot my audition tape. But Jack was always, he was always a champion for you. He always encouraged me. For some reason, he and Bob saw something in me that to this day I still don't understand why, but he always encouraged me. He wanted me to do the Switzer show, for instance, and when I did that my final year at the station, and he and Bob were always encouraging me to do play-by-play. I remember they wanted me to just do a radio broadcast of Oklahoma Christian and back then Bethany Nazarene basketball, and they showed me how to set it up and how to sell it, and I had no clue what I was doing, but he was always right there for you to bounce off, and no matter how bad things got, Jack would always seem to calm things down. No doubt my favorite personality was Bob Berry. Bob was like a father to me in times of stress and trouble, and it seemed like the wheels were coming off the car. Bob was always there along with Robbie. But Bob was the most gentle man I've ever been in my life. Why he hired me, to this day, I have no idea. I asked him hundreds of times, and he just would laugh. And it was his humor, I think, that's something I've tried to carry on in the tradition of Bob. It's kind of my homage to Bob Berry. When I do games now, I'm always cracking up with the crew. I'm doing stupid things and silly things. But Bob's sense of humor was priceless. He'd always have the worst jokes. He goes, he'd come up to you and say, hey, hear about the Aggie fight song? And then he'd tell some off-color joke that was just hysterical. But he'd always do the same thing. When he'd go to hand you the keys to the car, he'd always drop them. And you'd have to pick them up. You knew he was going to do it, but it was still funny. Or you'd say, Bob, I don't know how to get there. And he'd go, oh, okay, do you know where the post office is? I'd say, yeah. And he goes, well, that has nothing to do with it. It was the same jokes time after time after time. But he was such a gentleman. He taught me so much about play-by-play. He taught me so much about treating people correctly. And I owe Bob Berry an awful lot for that, and I will never forget him, no matter how long my career goes or where it takes me. And the whole experience at WKY and KTVY and KFOR for me was the foundation that has allowed me to do this job and do it somewhat successfully for over 35 years. And I owe so much to everybody at that station and for building the foundation of my life.